Hello. I'd like to take just a few minutes of your time to discuss the new materials found in the Township Board Agenda Packet for the upcoming September 12th meeting on the GOREC PUD. Since we're just a short time out from this meeting, I do want to apologize for how late you're receiving this. Unfortunately, an 11th hour submission on the part of the applicant left little time for analysis or response. Also, please consider this video to be an addendum to the prior video played at the May meeting. All concerns raised in that video still stand, and I would encourage you to rewatch it as a refresher on the countless ways this application is incompatible with the many layers of our local laws. Today we're going to focus on the noise study conducted by ABD, the technical memo from Wade Trim regarding intersection safety, and the correspondence regarding Twin Lakes events. While it was nice to see that the applicant went beyond the very friendly but highly unqualified party equipment rental guy for sound analysis, the study submitted in your packet is deeply flawed and comes to conclusions not backed up broadly by science, our observations, or even by their own data, nor does it answer the sound-related questions posed by trustees. We once again hired one of the most credentialed audio engineers in the state to conduct a peer review of this study. You'll all be receiving copies of this review once finalized, but the following will help to illustrate many of its findings on why the submitted study fails to prove that amplified event music will not be a significant adverse effect. Their conclusions rely heavily on the loudness of the music being canceled out by the baseline background or ambient noise of the environment. They took background measurements for 24 hours, which showed numbers consistent with our own measurements, averaging 40 to 50 decibels during the day and dropping down to 30 decibels or less in the evening. This was just background ambient measurements. The simulated event sound test only took place for 2 hours and in late afternoon hours. There are several obvious problems here. They performed the simulation at a time of day when there's significantly more ambient sound to cancel the music out, and not at a time when receptions actually happen. Weddings themselves might happen from 3 to 5 in the afternoon when there's a higher baseline of 50 decibels of background noise, but we're not concerned about vow exchanges getting out of hand. We're concerned with the loud amplified music from receptions that will go late into the night and well into the time when there's 30 decibels or less of ambient noise to offset against the amplified music. And as even ABD notes in their 24-hour monitoring, the measured evening background noise level of 30 decibels is as low as their device can measure, and it's possible that the actual background ambient noise in the evening hours, when receptions happen, could dip into the mid-20s. We're talking about 4 to 8x worth of perceptible background noise being incorrectly factored into their afternoon simulation to cancel out the chicken dance. Much to their credit, ABD almost gets there in one of their significant takeaways, noting that, due to very low background noise during the evening, any events happening during the evening hours will become noticeable. They fall short, however, in explaining the extent of the effect, how it negates their afternoon simulation conclusions, and the time they note it begins, 9 p.m., is far later than what we've observed in terms of ambient background noise drop-off, actually starting closer to 7 on most calm summer nights. And then there's the problem of wind. The sound simulation was conducted on a very windy afternoon, with wind speeds over the speed given in the national standard that addresses outdoor measurements. This wind would have increased the background sound level from wind in the trees. Not only was the simulation performed in an unrealistic time of day with disproportionate background and wind to taint the results, but they also chose to play music at a level of 80 to 85 decibels.
In there it said that bands were about 100 decibels.
The same goes for most DJs who play closer to 100 to 105 decibels. This is 15 to 20 decibels less than a real-world simulation would require. This difference is very significant because even like the party equipment rental guy said,
okay, we perceive, and it's a perception thing. It's not a mathematical equation. It's a perception thing by most people that a 10 dB decibel SPL increase would be perceived as twice as loud.
Several members of the board wisely noted in May that the parameters of any study done should be comprehensive and realistic.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a good point for us is if we get a report and you take measurements, say we consider that that's the baseline and it's windy and there's a bunch of ducks around and somebody's out maybe mowing the grass, we're going to set an unrealistic expectation of what the baseline is. So
I would want to make sure that when you're doing that, you are doing it at different times of the day, different wind types during the day, and from all points, all locations, so that it will reach every option.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense to do it on a Monday at 10 o'clock when it's a different atmosphere.
But that's not what we got. Not only was the simulation performed in an unrealistic time of day with disproportionate background and wind to taint the results, but the music was played at 2 to 4 times lower perceived volume than would be played by a DJ at the kinds of events GOREC is requesting permission to host. Beyond the flawed simulation, there are several other issues with the study. Much like the planning review, the sound study leans heavily on the assertion that noise annoyance will be mitigated because speakers will be turned away from the lakeshore. Beyond being very difficult to enforce, this ignores the basic principle of acoustics that low-frequency sound, like bass from a subwoofer, is omnidirectional. This means that the thump-thump-thump of YMCA will freely emanate in all directions, regardless of where the speaker is facing. Pointing the loudspeaker away from the water may decrease the dB level some, but it's not going to affect the bass level. This pointing the speakers the other direction solution also requires us to forget that people live in the other directions as well. And as shared in the May meeting,
I live at 435 Hobbs Highway, so I am not on Rennie, I am not on Bass. I am about 3/4 of a mile from the intersection. I heard Josh's sound test through the woods.
this study also places itself in a vacuum, void of the realities of a busy event center and campground. The annoyance of amplified music will only be compounded by the noise of a busy campground, hundreds dancing and singing, and sounds from vendors and increased traffic, all disrupting the ordinance-protected peace of an otherwise tranquil area. And much like its predecessor analysis, the study ignores the science of how sound travels over water. Anyone who's ever sat on a lakeshore at night and heard someone talking in a fishing boat 3/4 of the way across the lake has witnessed this effect firsthand. Lakes don't have secrets at night. Critical environmental factors such as temperature inversion, lack of absorption over a reflective surface, and prevailing wind direction can quadruple perceived volume. Quadruple! This amplification-like phenomenon is a common occurrence on the kind of summer nights these events will end up destroying for neighbors. And remember, the most intense commercial activity is not interior to the site as the application review incorrectly claims. The main venue, Besser Lodge, sits atop a hill, unbuffered from the shoreline. This sound will travel unabated across the water to nearby neighbors and beyond. Let's also not forget, all this study presents you with is numbers and charts. Just data. Agreeing with these skewed conclusions would require you to ignore what we've all heard with our own ears, courtesy of the one real-world demonstration that was actually conducted at a relevant time for receptions with a far more realistic and representative ambient noise level, with music actually played at a level consistent with that of DJs and bands, and observed from multiple locations around the lake. Please recall from May. At the nearest neighbors on Autumn Trail, it sounded like you were at the party. 8/10 of a mile across the water on the shore of Woods and Waters, you could hear every lyric and every thump. Someone in the same home 8/10 of a mile away with windows closed could hear the music with headphones on. The difference between what they're concluding and what you're actually hearing can also be partially expressed visually. This graph from the ABD study shows measurements from their simulated music event. All of those colored squiggly lines you see represent measurements at each observed location on the GOREC property. They took short-term measurements to simulate a music event by playing songs at 80 to 85 decibels. At distances from the sound source, this yields a 40 to 60 decibel noise level. ABD concludes that there's no issue here because the measured 40 to 60 decibel range of the squigglies you see here falls within the same measured range of existing background sound, also at 40 to 60 decibels, canceling each other out and yielding no significant changes in received noise levels at measured locations. As mentioned earlier, this is highly problematic. We start here with the same 40 to 60 decibel range of measured afternoon background sound and simulated music canceling each other out, averaged at about 50 decibels. But then we consider the actual evening ambient background level, as measured by both us and ABD, is somewhere at 30 decibels or less. And then correct for the fact that DJs play over 100 decibels, not the simulated 80 to 85, and make the same adjustment for distance. And you'll clearly see that the difference between ambient background and music noise level is far greater. They could have and should have easily demonstrated this, but they didn't, and I think it's pretty obvious why. And recall that because human perception of loudness actually works in base 2 scale, they're attempting to add in 4 to 8x worth of perceived background, and they're also underplaying their music by 2 to 4x perceived lower volume. What this doesn't show is the quadrupling effect previously discussed from the water factor. Add that in, and the perceived gap between background and music would only grow further. You didn't get the study you asked for or the study this request deserved. I could go on with questions about why they're referencing an ordinance written for a city for assessment of a rural location, or why they're using multifamily levels in an area with single-family homes around a lake, or get far more technical on how the analysis and conclusions are misleading because the analysis doesn't really get at audibility, or rather the real-world perceptibility of music relative to background noise. Or we could talk about the intrusion into the area's soundscape, because 56 decibels of loon sounds we're accustomed to in the background is not the same thing as 56 decibels of the chicken dance. But I don't have to go further into these. The submitted analysis is woefully inadequate given the stakes, what was requested by the township, and what's already been demonstrated. Now I'd like to take just a moment to discuss the very brief technical memo from Wade Trim regarding intersection safety. What was needed and wisely requested was
A more thorough traffic study done, which includes the quality of the roads that will be accessed, Hobbs Highway and Scout Camp, so that I don't believe that the discussion that was had on traffic today was sufficient.
What we got was a 2-pager that ignores more broad traffic and road condition concerns and instead just focuses on the intersection and projects future intersection safety based on historic usage, when it's clearly been established that future use will be of far greater intensity. Beyond being an incomplete report, this conclusion defies common sense and logic. It's reckless to say that an intersection that hasn't been used for the last 6 years will be safe under increased intensity because there were no accidents when there was also no traffic. We couldn't find a PE who could do a review in time, but qualified civil engineers have privately and candidly shared with me that it's crazy to think that crash rates will remain the same with an increased traffic count without any safety changes or changes in general. Historical crash rates are typically used, but they have to factor in changes to the traffic counts to get an accurate depiction of future crash rates at a higher volume. Typically, you take the historic traffic counts and put a growth factor on it based on historical trends or other influential factors like large venues that have high peak volumes. This is common engineering practice nationwide when looking at traffic counts, crash history, and future operations. Lastly, I'd like to address the correspondence regarding Twin Lakes. Supervisor Friend reached out to the manager of the Twin Lakes Recreation Area to see if their hosted events were a source of consistent or continual issues for neighbors. While there are some fine suggestions in there in terms of alcohol considerations, we find the comparison to GOREC and the conclusions reached regarding neighborhood disturbance to be of little value to the present circumstances. In his response, Mr. Walsh reassures that they have never had any issue with any of the events that have taken place at the park. If you visit the Twin Lakes Event Center, as we did, you quickly see one possible explanation for this. As you can clearly see from the video in the overhead satellite map, nobody really lives here. I'm uncertain as to how the fact that no complaints coming from a lake with no population brings any relevant comparison to the conversation. These new materials don't answer your questions, don't resolve our concerns, and they certainly don't rise to your standards of a preponderance of evidence to prove that these intense activities won't have adverse effects. They're just bad science, illogical engineering, and false equivalencies used to justify a conclusion. Putting all this technical analysis aside, I'd like to conclude with a quote from my good friend Terry Brandt. "Let's rely on common sense. Fishing boat science says it's silly to try to scientifically quantify the level of deterioration of our lifestyle and environment and explain it in numerical units when it's ridiculously obvious that our lifestyle and environment will be severely diminished if this application is approved. Thank you for your time, and please vote no."